coordinator of the Master's Program History and Philosophy of Science. He is also a member of the Descartes Center for the History of and Philosophy of Science. His research interests include history of astronomy, space science, and meteorology, history of international collaboration in science, and the history of university. David will present to us the paper "The Future Was Out There: Space and Astronomy in History." Thank you very much, David, for your participation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here. I am sharing my slides. I hope they are visible. I'm honored to be here as part of this great ongoing project festival on behalf of the Inter-Union Commission for the History of Astronomy, a shared commission of the DHST and the International Astronomical Union. So that also means it includes a very wide variety of people and interests, from really the oldest study of the most ancient astronomy to ongoing big science project, also from retired professional astronomers to professional historians and STS scholars. So it's a very varied community. But interestingly, looking around in this community and in the works they presented, and also in the histories that they tell, it's noticeable that there's two big topics or narratives in the history of astronomy that keep popping up. I mean, it's a gross simplification, but I would like to just present them, these two narratives, because I think part of the relevance, what history of astronomy can do in the present and in the future, is also related to studying those two narratives and how they interact. So that is what I would like to discuss with you now. And one of them is the focus on the astronomy out there, looking up at the sky, at the heavens, studying the cosmos. And this is presented, again, this is a simplification, but on the other hand, the narrative is really strong, really present still today, as presenting astronomy as kind of the paradigmatic natural science, the oldest science, the first one to use mathematical methods, the purest science with no practical applications, which is actually a more modern view, because it used to have practical applications in timekeeping and navigation. It's one of the few sciences that went from practical to more academic rather than the other way, or to more philosophical rather than the other way around. Connected to big questions about life, the universe, and everything, the big questions of our place in the universe, connected to popular culture, to cultures more generally. This narrative of astronomers of we are all under the same sky, we study the same stars and planets, we see the same ones, and we all have stories about it, even though those stories, of course, are different per culture. This is a really strong narrative, and it's, I think, one of the reasons that astronomy is so often popularized. This narrative is used in popular outreach and with great success. And the most recent version being those James Webb Space Telescope images, like you see on the right. So this is the grand narrative, one could say. There's also, however, the focus on astronomy down here on Earth, the people, the instruments, the quest for increasing precision, the quest for more light. That's the internal story, often studied in great detail by even also by professional astronomers, or more widely, if I might say so as a historian, more interestingly, the wider material culture, the links to politics, to culture, and in the narrative, the link to technological innovation. This is linked to practical issues. This is linked still today. Narratives about astronomy often also are about not the astronomical science, but the telescopes, the instruments, and the technology that goes into them. Often linked to military technology. That's not so highlighted, but as a historian, you can see this very clearly. From the telescope was first presented as a military instrument before anyone ever pointed it up to the sky. up to the James Webb Space Telescope, which is full of technology developed for military and national security purposes. I find that interesting, the universal pure narrative versus the down-to-earth practical and political narratives. And of course, they are very related. I mean, the idea that progress in astronomy is very strongly technology-driven plays a central role in the history of astronomy, again, especially since the development of telescopes, the quest for more light, the quest for better observation technology. But it's remarkable, even though they are related, it's remarkable how separate the narratives are often presented. In the popular realm, in the legitimation of astronomy nowadays, the legitimation of funding, but also in the history. And actually, in my own research, I saw it in the history of astronomy in the 20th century, where we see an increasing separations between instruments and research in various ways, including geographical. From about 1900, telescopes were moved away from cities and cultural centers and universities to remote locations where that had the best observing conditions. Mount Wilson Observatory is an early example of that, although I actually have to give the French author Jules Verne also credit, because in his book, The Voyage to the Moon, he placed a telescope in the Rocky Mountains in the 1860s. But they were geographically removed. So now most of the Earth-based telescopes are centralized, located on mountains in Hawaii, La Palma, in Chile, and in deserts in, for example, South Africa. Later, with radio astronomy and space astronomy, the instruments became institutionally separated from universities, from academic research centers. The funding streams became separate. And the legitimation also became separate. On the one hand, the science was legitimated with these universal narratives, and the telescopes were often funding applications for telescopes, which is the most expensive part of the research, was legitimated often with links to technological development here on Earth. Interestingly, also, you see that telescopes also got their own role in public culture, popular culture. They became actors and celebrities in their own right. We know the names of Galileo and Copernicus and all the great heroes, but I would think that the Leviathan of Parsonstown, the big telescope in the mid-19th century in Ireland, was maybe the first scientific instrument that became more famous than the person who built it or used it for research. It was more famous than Lord Rosse, who owned it and had it built. And today, the Hubble Space Telescope or the James Webb Space Telescope are more famous than any astronomer who uses it, which I find really fascinating. They have, you see that now sometimes in other sciences as well. Now, interestingly, while the science is presented as universal and a shared culture of all humanity, telescope, and it's uncontroversial. It's not politically sensitive. It's no privacy issues, no ethical issues. It's very easy, also easy to present in that way as the pure science. Telescopes are not. There are controversies about telescopes, about the locations where they are built. The location, I mentioned a few in Chile, South Africa. They are increasingly in the global south, in part because that the southern hemisphere points towards the center of the galaxy. So, I mean, astronomically, the most interesting objects are to be viewed from there. They're often built in areas with low population density, which means that the people who live there are often marginalized. A small number of people who don't have a big say in policy decisions. It's often remote areas, which also means that there are often areas of environmental value in mountains, in deserts, in volcanoes, that sort of thing. And often on mountain tops, a noticeable mountain top, the highest peaks in the area, which also means they can have cultural or religious meaning. And most famously or infamously is what you see here, Mauna Kea at Hawaii, which is a location that is held sacred by the Hawaiian population. And the controversies because of that, are now impacting the construction of one of the major new telescopes, the 30-meter telescopes. And what I find interesting is in this controversy, you see the clash of these two narratives. On the one hand, you see astronomers who think that their science is universal, so who could ever object to it? On the other hand, we see local populations who see that it has very locally specific consequences and not always positive ones. And those two narratives don't match up, and they're talking past each other or clashing. We also see that astronomers who defend the project try to invoke the universality, the universal nature of their science, and even the spiritual, the religious, the cultural meaning that is so visible in history, in their attempts to reach out to the opponents of the telescopes. And in other words, they are trying to shift the narrative from the instrument-focused narrative to the universal one. So this has plays a very clear role in the dynamic of the controversies. And I think this demonstrates what history of astronomy can do and can contribute. The historians have developed in the past decades the tools to understand different narratives and their roles in history, and how astronomy as a science can be at the same time very human and have a universal meaning, or at least reputation, characteristic, a universal image. How a science can be local and global at the same time, how those two realms relate to each other, how they can clash, how they can, the interesting dynamic between them, and sometimes problematic. And that's the link to the future. Astronomy can help understand the dynamic of these discussions, and therefore contribute to discussions about future telescopes. Responsible sighting is now an increasingly important topic in discussions about new telescope projects, and I'm very pleased to see that several of those big projects have included working groups on history and culture, precisely for this reason. So this is a direct relevance for the history of astronomy, which I think is relevant. Though I think also, as historians, we should never forget that apart from that, we also just have very cool, inspiring stories to tell, and that's also part of the value.
David, sorry to interrupt. You have 5 minutes left. Thank you.
I was actually just done. Thank you very much.
Great. I was waiting for your 1 minute left. 1 more minute, and I wouldn't stop you. Thank you very much. Just to put things on the right place here, let's welcome Professor Ekmeleddin İhsanoğlu, and I'm very sorry for the misspelling. Professor, thank you for coming. We invited the other and started with David, and now we will pass to Sara, and then you will be our last speaker, okay? Yeah, Professor, you have, when you want to talk with us, we have to unmute your Zoom. You have the mute and unmute button on your bottom left side. There's a small microphone there. Yeah, you will see on your left bottom left, a small microphone.
Yes.
Icon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, Professor. Thank you very much for coming.
Well,
Welcome.
no, thank you very much.
Okay. We will now pass to Sara's presentation, and then after Sara's presentation, I will call you.
Okay.
Okay. If you don't mind, please to mute your microphone now until your presentation starts.
Okay. This is
In the same icon. Yeah, it's in the same icon, the small microphone icon. Thank you very much, Professor.
Pleasure.
Let's now pass the word to our colleague Sara Uckelman. Sara Uckelman is a logician and historian of logic. She completed her PhD with a dissertation entitled Modalities in Medieval Logic at the University of Amsterdam in 2009, and worked at the Universities of Tilburg and Heidelberg before joining Durham University in 2014. Sara, thank you very much for participating, and we are willing to hear your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who has come, and to the Division of Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science and Technology, who invited me to be their representative in this wonderful festival. I don't have slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what can the history of logic tell us about the future of logic, because I am interested in both of these aspects. I do a lot of work in the history of logic, but I am also actively teaching logic, developing the next generation of logicians, and wanting to see where the field can go from here. So I don't know how much you know about logic as a field of study, so I'll say a little bit about it as a scientific discipline. It is often characterized as the study of argumentation, or more precisely, the study of good arguments. Logic is interested in separating out the good arguments from the bad arguments, and then saying what makes these arguments good. It's also connected to notions of proof, so it has strong connections to mathematics and the idea that if you have a proof of some mathematical fact, then this gives us certainty. We know that it is necessarily true, that it couldn't have been another way. So logic as a scientific discipline has very strong connections modernly to both mathematics and computer science. You might have heard of like Boolean logic or Boolean circuits. These are what underpins the workings of our computers. And it all comes back to this idea of how to figure out from a structured way what is a reliable way of transmitting information and gaining knowledge. Historically, though, logic was often very closely connected to the more linguistic side of things. How do we speak? How do we talk to each other? What are different ways that our language can be used to mean different things? How does this reflect actual argumentative practice if you're out there talking with somebody, trying to convince them that you are right and they are wrong? So logic also has these connections to a lot of kind of contemporary real world social situations, particularly if you are arguing with strangers on the internet. Now, the history of logic kind of encompasses both of these aspects, the kind of notion of mathematical proof, rigorous deduction, and the more social aspects. If you look at kind of the origins of logic, it's usually going to be traced back to Aristotle in ancient Greece. He was the first one who wrote theoretical treatises on the nature of good argumentation as a tool for scientific knowledge. So he developed the notion of syllogisms, a very kind of constrained notion of argument form, which will always guarantee the truth of the conclusion if the premises are true. So you might be familiar with some kind of very simple syllogisms. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. From this, you can necessarily conclude that Socrates, since he is a man, must also be mortal. So that's one sort of tradition that we have, and it was a very strongly productive tradition. It got passed into the Western European tradition through Latin translations in Boethius. It got into the Arabic tradition, which then fed back into the Western European tradition, and ultimately laid the foundations for the development of the field of logic as it is studied nowadays. But it's not the only route through the history of logic. Other cultures who didn't necessarily have kind of access to Greek philosophy were still interested in the question of how can we look at formal characteristics, the structure of arguments, in ways that allow us to determine when you've got good evidence for holding a conclusion, saying that you know something. So another very interesting tradition is the Buddhist and Hindu development of what is called anumana, or it's translated inference. And here we have other formal structures of arguments that allow us to move from certain claims, maybe based in empirical things, observations in the world, to conclusions about the way the world has to be or is likely to be given the information that we have. So both of these traditions are interested in the structure of arguments and also rooted in how we know things about the world. So they have very close ties, not just to science, but also to our everyday practice. what are the justifications that we need to have in order to explain why we know things or why we think we know things, or even more simple things like how do we, what are the explanations for the sorts of decisions that we might make on a day-to-day basis, or how can we convince other people to change their mind about something or to take a different course of action. So this is saying something about kind of what logic looked like in history. Now, if we ask ourselves what the role of kind of the history of logic as a study or as a discipline, what kind of role does this have? Now, this is often kind of the purview, the exclusive purview of the academy. People doing the history of logic are in universities reading historical texts that nobody has looked at for hundreds of years. And a question I am often asked is, well, what is the relevance of this? Why are you looking at these obscure 14th century Latin texts? What does this have to do for logic nowadays? And I actually think that there is a really important thing that the history of logic can tell us about the future of logic, and it has to do with who gets to have access to it. So the study of the history of logic is something that is done in universities, but also historically, logic was the purview of the educated elite. You see this from ancient Greece, you see this in the Buddhist traditions. It's the people who have access to higher education, to religious study, and these things. So who gets excluded? For a large amount of history, women. Women didn't get to go to university or weren't allowed access to the same educational opportunities at university that men might have had up until the 19th, 20th century. But also minorities, poor people, anybody who wasn't part of this educated elite. Understanding why this happens and how it happens, I think, is actually crucial for understanding where we are today with the development of both kind of logic as a research discipline, but also as a teaching field. Who are the sorts of students who come to my classes? What kinds of people have access to learning about logic? And again, it is still very much the educated elite. And there are still contexts in which these same sorts of groups of people are either excluded from the opportunity to learn logic, or even worse, get to have logic or logically related concepts turned against them. So rationality, a key component, reason of good argumentation and the study of logic, is often used in contemporary social situations, social media, as a weapon against certain groups of people. You can shut somebody's viewpoint or perspective down by saying, you're not acting rationally, you're being too emotional, or I'm just trying to have an argument with you, but you're bringing in all of these, all of your feelings about these issues that I'm talking about. Be more rational, take a step back. And I think that this is a very strange thing to happen, but we can understand a bit more why it is that things like rationality and logic get essentially turned into weapons of silencing groups of people by looking at, well, where has this discipline come from? Who are the people who have historically had the opportunity to access it? So history of logic helps teach us to recognize these patterns of exclusion. Therefore, once we recognize them, we can fight back against them. And once we know where we come from, we have the tools that we need to be able to try to build a more inclusive, less exclusive field of study, so that hopefully logic going forward isn't used as a tool of silencing people and is accessible not just to people who get to go to university, but to anybody who is interested in the very question that Aristotle was interested in the beginning, which is, how can we use our faculties of reasoning to learn things about the world? So that's what I think history of logic has to say about the future of logic. And I look forward very much to seeing what kinds of questions and thoughts you might have on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara, for your presentation. I will now present our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Ekmeleddin İhsanoğlu. Professor İhsanoğlu has been a pioneering figure in the field of history of science in Islam. He has been awarded the Alexander Korea Medal in History of Science, given by the International Academy of History of Science in Paris in 2008, and 20 honorary doctorates and professorships from different European, American, Russian, and Islamic universities. Most significant among these honorary doctorates is the history of science from the Galileo Chair at the University of Padua. He was a founder and co-founder of many institutions in the field, such as the first independent department in the history of science in Istanbul University, Turkey, in 1984, the Turkish Society for the History of Science, and the DHST Commission on History of Science and Technology in Islamic Societies. Professor will present to us today the paper Towards a Global and Comprehensive History of Science, Concept and Implication. Professor, please, we are here to hear you. John?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, at the outset of my intervention, I would like to place on record my appreciation for Professor Marcus Kyoto and Professor Thomas Haddad for organizing such a wonderful event. My intervention is rather a tale of an outgoing generation, with the hope that future generations of historians of science will have more correct picture, more correct depiction of history of science and its development. History of science is a new academic discipline established between two wars, between Belgium and the United States, and then we all know how it developed in different parts of our universities. My generation was born at the end of the Second World War, and we witnessed the Hiroshima and Nagasaki catastrophes and explosion of atomic bombs and killings of millions of people, devastating towns in few minutes. So the prophecy of George Sarton, the founder of our academic discipline, George Sarton, his prophecy that science and history of science is the basis of new humanism. This prophecy did not materialize. On the contrary, we have very sad turn of events. So, because he says new humanism, because science generates its own values. So Sarton was expecting that science will create new values and these values will prevail. However, this was not happened. And science and its history did not produce humanistic values, and man's evil wrongdoings prevailed. So what we need really, beside history of science, is deontology. We need deontology based on moral obligations and commitment to universally accepted high values. This is what we need, next to science and history of science. Now, when we look to how the portrait of science in the modern science in 20th century came out, we will see that there is a European depiction which neglects other contributions of different civilizations. So according to this portrait, sometimes between 1500 and 1700, modern science was invented in Europe. This is a history which usually begins with the Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus in his book on the revolutions of heavenly spheres, published 1543. Copernicus argued that the Earth goes around the sun. This was a radical idea since the time of ancient Greeks. Astronomers had believed that Earth was at the center of the universe. And then you have Galileo Galilei, and then you have Charles Darwin, and you have Einstein at the 20th century. This is story of modern science, and is it true? Is this true that from Copernicus to Einstein, no other scientists contributed to this development? This is not, in our understanding, this is not correct. And in one of the young generations, historians of science, English historian of science, James Baskett, he says that this story is not true, and the foundings of our career did not take in consideration other factors. And in James Baskett's words, he says, and I quote him, "This story is a myth, that European science as such, it is not European, it has many other contributors." For instance, if we consider that modern science started with Copernicus, do we take in consideration that the mathematical models Copernicus used in his solar system was based on Islamic mathematics? And this has been proved. Two C's coupled, etc., etc. And this is, it doesn't take. But here you can have, after the first layer, you have so many accumulations of scientific advancement that is not explained to the readers. So in this distorted picture of development of science, there's a false, beside that the layers are not shown to the readers, there's also another false conception of golden age. False. Again, George Sarton, when he speaks about certain civilizations, and in particular on Islamic civilization, he says that first 4 centuries were a golden age of Islamic science. The rest does not worth discussion. And this is not correct. We have many examples of the advancement of science, particularly mathematics and astronomy, up to the end of the 16th century. The Istanbul Observatory and the observations made by Taqiyuddin and others were all there. So we have to reconsider this. Third point, which I would like to highlight, that beyond this golden age, there are 600 years of Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman Empire, there was an active scientific discussions, productions, and for the last 40 years, we published 18 volumes of literature of Ottoman scientific findings gathered from 550 manuscript collections all over the world in 50 countries, and all studied, deciphered, and classified biobibliographically. And we have a mention of 5,000 authors, 20,000 works, and many other, and this is already published, and an English edition of 3 volumes just appeared a few days ago. So how you can say that this is not existing and it doesn't worth studying? Last point which I would like to highlight here in this short intervention, the issue of the intervention between East and West, South and North in pre-modern and modern time. According to the standard narrative that it was Napoleon Bonaparte in the end of the 18th century, when he led his campaign expedition to Egypt, that this is the first time the Muslim world, Muslim scholars came together or came across modern European science through Napoleon and his scientific enterprise. And this is not the case. The case, as has proven now, first translations from Latin, then from Italian, then from French to Turkish and Arabic was made as early as 16th century. 16th century, not end of 18th century. So I think this call made here, and this is where I appreciate this session very much so, that we need a global history of science. In this intervention, I need not to go to many details because I think time is running, but I would like just to reiterate this call which I am doing here is not the first time. I am not the first one to do it. There is a need for a global history of science, where you take all aspects of interactions, north, south, or south, north, east, west, west, east. And I will end quoting Jürgen Wren and Malcolm Hyman in their introduction to a co-authored book on globalization of knowledge in history. They say, and I quote, "As there is only one history of life on this planet, there is also only one history of knowledge." One history of life, one history of knowledge. Accordingly, education is a precondition to globalization process as well as a consequence of their realization. Let me draw your attention and the attention of those who are interested in contributing to global history of science and technology, that there is a big accumulation of knowledge. First, you have the great British English scholar Needham on China. Then you have a 18-volume on Ottoman science, and many others in different directions. Scholars from after Second World War started this. I started this 40 years ago with my students, my colleagues. And I think this is high time to reconsider such a big project. And I thank you for giving me the floor and the opportunity to explain this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a pleasure to hear you. And I will now pass to our time for questions. First, I would like to start, so you take notes. There are two questions, one in the chat, one for Sara, another one for David. For Sara, from Kostas Kavlaglu, could it be possible for Sara to expand a little on the other non-Western modes of logic that she has already alluded to? And for David, a question that came to me via chat. You mentioned the very important question of responsible setting of large telescopes. Can you elaborate a bit more on how the history of astronomy is informing work in this area. And before you answer, I would like to give you some comments, and not precisely just comments, just to start the discussion here in my concerns. This is a privilege as a chairman, and I would like to start saying first, EU3 are dealing with a sort of methodological problem. That means you three are telling us about different forms of knowledge that compound the scientific or the so-called scientific knowledge. This is true in the fields of astronomy, in the field of logic, and in the field of science, especially in the mathematical science in general. So, the first methodological problem, if to consider the history of knowledge in a broad perspective and the history of science in a broad perspective, and again quoting Uckelman, there's only one history of knowledge. Perhaps according to the same Uckelman in the other book, Rethinking Science for the Anthropocene, we should think in the scientific or the knowledge development in terms of the long term. And this is a methodological problem because it's not possible to us in our everyday research, in our research centers, to go always to the long term. Sometimes due to the research agenda of our fields or our institutes, we are looking to small, very circumscribed objects and very circumscribed geographical locations and so on. So how to conciliate both things? This is a good question. How to look to the long-term development of the history of science and knowledge, as suggested by Professor Ekmeleddin, and how to conciliate with our research focused in smaller objects, more focused objects. This is a very interesting topic that I would like to see you comment. And after that, for Sara, I would like you to comment a little bit the public dimension of logic as a form of knowledge. What is knowledge in logic what is the public dimension? You mentioned women. That's another methodological problem because for the early modern sources, where are the women? So we have to find them, and how to find them. And this perhaps leads us to the methodological problem of seeing what is the public knowledge on logic. For example, the public in general, or people in general, know something about the non-contradiction problem or other advanced problems in logic that could be translated to broader audiences and became important in more social strata. And talking about social strata, I would like David to comment a little bit about the circulation of astronomical knowledge between different social groups, artisans and theoretical thinkers, or people in the field, such as navigators, seafarers, or other kinds of knowledge agents, and the academic or more learned circles of society, and how from one part to another how was being the dialogue between this, and what implication you can see, and how does it points it to the future of the history of astrology. So if you can organize yourself to answer, and and the audience probably are here to hear you.
I would be happy to kick things off. I will take first the specific question received from the audience, because I'm so glad that you asked I would have said something in my presentation, but was conscious of time. So one of the very simple sort of principles of inference that you find in early Buddhist texts is what is called nowadays the three-step argument. And it has a particular structure. It starts off with a thesis, so what it is that you're trying to prove. And it's going to be something of the form that you've got some subject that is under investigation, and the thesis is that that thing that you're investigating has some particular property. And then the next step is giving the ground or the warrant for your thesis. And this will be by looking at the subject that you are investigating and asserting that it has another property, so property 2. And then you've got the kind of the statement that brings it together, the indispensability, the warrant connecting the two properties, which is something along the lines of, well, whatever has the first property also has the second property. And then you restate your conclusion, therefore the subject has the property in question. So I'll give an example of this to make it a bit more concrete. A very common one that you find in a bunch of early Buddhist texts is the thesis is there is fire on the mountain. So the mountain is the subject under investigation. The property of having fire is the property we're trying to establish. The ground for this thesis is because there is smoke. So the presence of smoke is our grounding property. And then the warrant that connects the two is that wherever there is fire, wherever there is smoke, there is fire. Often this can be supplemented with kind of examples to show that this isn't just an ad hoc connection between the two properties, but you can point to a kitchen. Whenever there is smoke in a kitchen, there is fire. You can also point to negative examples like a lake. So a lake is a place where there's no smoke and no fire. So you can use these examples and this structure of kind of the relationship between different properties to then go from something that you might be able to see empirically, like, oh, I can see smoke on the mountain, to the conclusion that therefore there must be fire. So that's an example of the three-step argument. Moving on to the more broader question of like, well, how do we do big picture history of science, history of logic, history of whatever? This is something that any historian struggles with on a regular basis. I've commented on the fact that people often ask, well, what's the point of looking at these 13th century texts? And sometimes one of the responses that I give is that as a society, as a world, it is a privilege to be able to spend our time learning things that don't necessarily have any immediate practical short-term outcomes. In part because you never know when you are out there gaining knowledge, you never know what is going to be the thing that is going to be useful until after you've already learned it. You can't decide in advance, this is what will help us achieve our goals for impact and innovation, so I'm only going to pursue them. A lot of knowledge, a lot of science, a lot of history is serendipity. So this is an argument that I come back with quite often. It's like, we need to give people the space to do the irrelevant stuff or the big picture stuff, because we never know what of these things is actually going to turn out to be relevant or to have good kind of short-term implications. But it is a very tough thing to have to deal with when jobs, funding structures, grant applications are so much focused on the 1 year, 3 year, 5 year plans. And then finally, I want to say one thing on the Fabiano's question about kind of the public role of logic and the public nature of it, because this is one of the most intriguing things that the study of the history of logic has taught me, which is that whether logic as a tool for kind of disputation or convincing or argument, whether this is considered a public or a private activity, is intimately linked to whether women get to have access to studying it. So in the Middle Ages, logic was very closely tied to disputation, and disputation was something that was done in public with audiences. And therefore, this was not something suited for women to do because women were not public figures. They were supposed to be at home, taking care of the children, raising virtuous households and things like that. So there was no point for women to learn logic because it was primarily something that was used in the public sphere. Shift a couple centuries further to the 19th century, and you get people like Christine Ladd Franklin, who actually wanted to be an astronomer, but astronomy was done in kind of sort of public spaces, big labs, lots of men, not suitable for a woman. So she got shunted into pure mathematics and eventually into logic because this was something that you could pursue in the privacy of your own home. You could be a mathematician, you could be a logician on your own. And so suddenly, as soon as logic becomes a private subject, it becomes open to women. And this has its connections to kind of the ways that public social media figures, particularly, ones who have rather radical views, they are painting themselves as public figures and using logic, rationality, devil's advocate arguments, sorts of things as ways of trying to kind of keep out other people, to kind of keep it as this very kind of public activity sort of thing. So I will stop here to have time for other people's responses.
I don't know who wants to comment something next.
Yeah, shall I?
Yes, please. So, David, let's quickly follow, because we have only 6 minutes left, and perhaps we need to share our 6 minutes between you both.
Yeah, I'll be brief, but the comment about indeed the long-term or the big picture history and what can we do? How can we construct a new global big picture is and how do we? Well, your question was how to relate it to research, but actually I find in my that it's an even more urgent and difficult question in teaching. In teaching, you need some. There's very brief time. You really want to give the students some sense of what history of science is about, including all these nuances and varieties. I think the approach we've chosen in the History and Philosophy of Science program in Utrecht is to precisely not claim that there's only one history of knowledge, but discuss with the students that there are multiple histories and they have different meanings depending on different perspectives, who you're talking about, whose perspective you're adopting, which topic. And for example, focusing indeed on intercultural exchanges and not only in the great translation era, connection in the golden age of Islamic science, but also in other periods and other cultural exchanges. So to make that diversity and the encounters a theme. And I think that links a bit to the question about responsible citing. What can history add? I think that is one of the main things, the realization that knowledge and instruments, that things can have multiple meanings. And with apologies to Sara, they can have multiple meanings that contradict each other and still be true for even sometimes for the same people at the same time, if you look at the cultural or political level. Can see that in discussions about telescopes in South Africa, in the Karoo Desert. It's not enough to acknowledge the spiritual meaning for local population and to try to talk about that if you don't realize the whole history of South Africa that plays a role on the background, and that also, even if it's not explicitly mentioned in a discussion, that it is important to understand that whole long background and context. And I see that in discussions about some telescopes, proposed telescopes in Tanzania, in Angola, it is happening. Maybe not enough. There's a lot of work, of course, here still to be done. Absolutely. So we have to work on that.
Yeah, thank you.
The last question about the social groups, that's very easy. It's very difficult to answer, but very short to do. Seeing it different in every period and different for every group.
Okay, thank you very much, David. We have enough time to hear Professor Ekmeleddin. So please, Professor. And perhaps they will cut us off, because they will cut us off in 1 hour. So thank you very much. Professor, please.
Well, I thank you very much for giving me the floor once again. I think the idea is widely accepted. The problem is how to do it. And I have some experience with UNESCO in producing similar books on history of culture, history of science, etc. And in UNESCO, it is very bureaucratic, tedious machinery that you put energy, you put wheat, you put sugar, and then you get very small biscuits after all this great money and energy and meetings, etc. I think now is having this new technology online, getting understanding each other, agreeing on certain aspects, promoting certain notions is much better than UNESCO way. And if DHST takes such an endeavor, we can all contribute to its success. And we can produce, for instance, there is a Cambridge History of Science written by a gentleman called Ronan. Very good book. And it covers many aspects which were neglected before him. I got this book translated to Turkish with one of my assistants, and it's selling like a hot cake between young people. We can have many other examples. We can build on these examples, but we have to find a vehicle that advances this idea and builds upon it. I will be, it will not be a surprise for me if DHST would take such an endeavor.
Professor, I was warned that the session will be ended in 1 minute, and I would like to thank you for your presentation. Thank you, the audience. Thank you very much for your participation.